Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Leroy Martin at the Pentecostal Theological Seminary in Cleveland, Tennessee. We are here with Dr. Becky Hill, and we are talking about the book of Judges. This is our Bible study podcast number 9. Welcome, and we hope you will subscribe to the podcast. So we're picking up at chapter 4. We've talked about Othniel, and we've talked about Ehud, and we talked about Shamgar. Today we're going to look at Deborah and Barak. Deborah and Barak. Let me just start out and read a few verses there to get us going. Starting out with maybe verses 1 through 3. 1 through 3. Judges 4, 1 through 3. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. And the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hatzor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hakoyim. Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help. For he, that is Jabin, had 900 chariots of iron, and he oppressed the people of Israel cruelly for 20 years. Just to introduce this story, let's just remember that in the Old Testament, God only chose a small number of people to be prophets and representatives, leaders. And among those in the Old Testament, we find both men and women, and young and old. So it's important that we understand the wide diversity of people that God used as prophets. This diversity foreshadows the New Testament truth that all of God's people should be spokespeople for the Lord, witnesses of God's salvation. The ministry of these biblical prophets varied greatly. You have prophets like Moses, Elijah, and Elisha who did miracles and signs and wonders, but other prophets did not record any miracles. You have people like Moses and Samuel, and here Deborah, who are recognized as prominent leaders, but many of the prophets held no official position. So prophecy, when we say Deborah was a prophet, we read in verse number 4, Deborah was a prophet. We need to remember that essentially to be a prophet means someone who speaks for God, someone who shares God's message. So that is the kind of the simplest definition of what it means to be a prophet. And the goal of the prophets was to make disciples. That is, even when the prophets told the future, the goal of their telling of the future was so that people would serve God. That's what the prophets were all about. Share God's message so that people will serve the Lord. Discipleship. That's where we're headed. So now we've read in chapter 4, the first few verses. After Ehud died, there was an 80-year period of peace and safety, but the Israelites went back into sin and idolatry. Their backsliding produced then a repeat of the previous cycle, their cycle of sin and servitude, supplication, salvation, and then a time of security. This time, Israel is oppressed for 20 years by the Canaanite king Jabin of Hatzor. This is a northern city that Joshua had conquered many years earlier. Apparently, the people were able to rebuild the city and regain their strength because Israel had failed to drive them out completely. So, Dr. Hill, do you want to make a few comments about this first few verses?
Right, so we
Anything
do
you
have
see there?
repetition of or restatement of things that we've heard before, right? We've heard before that Israel continues to do evil, and that evil is characterized by their idolatry. So they continue to do evil in the sight of the Lord. And because they continue to do evil, then the Lord will sell them into the hand of an enemy or deliver them into the hand of the enemy. This time it is Jabin, king of Canaan. Uh, but we have a piece of new information, and it's the first time we have the commander of the enemy's army mentioned, Sisera, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, we're told that they cry out to the Lord for help. And one of the reasons why they cry out for help is because this enemy has 900 chariots of iron. Now, this is significant because if we go back to chapter 1, if we
Mm-hmm.
remember, the people could not drive out the inhabitants of the lands because they had iron chariots, right?
Right. Verse 19,
Right.
chapter 1.
So here we have the narrator of Judges mentioning that the king of Canaan, Jabin, and his commander Sisera, they have 900 chariots of iron, indicating their power and their strength. And so we also get this adjective that they oppressed the people of Israel cruelly for 20 years. So this is the longest they've been under servitude. First, we heard 8 years, then 18, now it's 20 years. So those are important elements that we see in these first 3 verses.
Right. Right. So out of the midst of this suffering, the Israelites cried out. It says they cried out to the Lord for help, and God, in His compassion, raised up another deliverer. But this time, to our surprise, God decides to use a woman, and Deborah, whose name means a bee, like a honeybee, is introduced as a prophet. And as a prophet, it says that she was judging Israel. She was already judging Israel in the tribe of Ephraim. And as a judge, people would come to her for justice. And as a prophet, she speaks for the Lord. This is essentially the role of Moses.
Right.
Um, and will notice through the story of Deborah many parallels to Moses. People came to Moses for judgment, and Moses was a prophet who spoke for the Lord. So it's not insignificant that this woman fulfills these roles traditionally assigned to men. But what is, I think, really astounding is in the Bible here, there's no indication that this was considered odd.
Right.
It
It does not
doesn't
say.
it doesn't say anything about Deborah. You know, Deborah was a prophetess. Now we know men are usually the prophets, but on this occasion, just one time, because there weren't any men around. Well, it doesn't say that. It doesn't say that it's unusual. It doesn't say that it's strange. It doesn't give any impression that it's out of the ordinary. There were, in fact, other women in the Old Testament. I believe Jewish tradition names 7 women prophets in the Old Testament. So that's not an odd thing. So Moses set up the institution of judge in Exodus chapter 18. And, everybody assumes that men fulfill those roles, but God doesn't. God does not conform to our expectations.
Or our
God,
ideologies.
God calls people, God created man and woman in God's image, men and women in God's image. And He said to both of them in Genesis chapter 1, "You are my representatives to rule over the earth." The man and the woman, He said that to. So God is using here Deborah, uh, a woman, a prophet. Those 7 women that Jewish tradition names are Sarah, the wife of Abraham, Miriam, the sister of Moses, Deborah, then Hannah, the mother of Samuel, Abigail, the wife, one of the wives of David, Huldah, the prophetess in
The time of Josiah.
the time of Josiah, when the book of the law was discovered in the temple, and then Esther. These are the 7. So also the New Testament includes a number of women prophets, and then Pentecostalism has accepted women ministers, prophets, preachers, and pastors from its very beginning. Pentecostalism has always accepted women prophets because of Acts chapter 2. On the day of Pentecost, Peter said, they said, "What is all this?" The men and the women were speaking in tongues. And Peter said, "It will come to pass in the last days, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, sons and your daughters," not just sons, "sons and your daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions, your old men will dream dreams. And on my servants, on my maidservants, I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they will prophesy." So churches today that do not approve of women ministers, they would say that Deborah's ministry implies a lack of qualified and willing men. Many, and even some scholars say that. But the scripture never says that. It makes no such statement. If God prefers only males, then why didn't he just call Barak directly? Why didn't he just call Barak directly? He called Ehud, he called Othniel, he called Gideon, and raised up Samson. So Barak is right there. Why doesn't he call him? He calls Deborah because God wants to use a woman in this case. So it's not from necessity that God uses Deborah. It's from God's divine choice. And God has a reason and a purpose for every person he chooses. So Deborah, and another argument, let me just mention one other thing, and I'll turn it over to you to elaborate a little bit. People have said that women ministers are an exception that God allows only in times of extreme spiritual crisis and chaos. Well, if that were true, Deborah would be near the end of the book of Judges when things were really bad. But she's at the beginning of Judges when things aren't as bad as they are at the end. The worst situation is at the end of the book. But there are no women judges at the end of the book. It's near the beginning, chapter 4, near the beginning, before things get so bad. So instead, before the decline is at its worst. Simply put, God chooses whoever he will, and his gifts are dispensed according to his divine wisdom, right? So let me read this, the first couple of verses about Deborah, and you can comment further. It says, "Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the people of Israel came up to her for judgment."
Right. So notice the qualifications of Deborah, right? She is first called a prophet, right? Then the next phrase is the wife of Lapidoth, which is translated here in my text. And then thirdly, she was judging Israel at the time. And then she used to sit under the palm of Deborah. So she had her own palm tree that people came to her for judgment. But I want to go over these verses here, or these qualifications. So in the Hebrew text, you would realize that these adjectives, so a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth. These are all female words used here, because in Hebrew we have two genders, the masculine gender and the feminine gender. And here it seems like the narrator does not want us to miss the fact that Deborah is a woman, right? And so we have all of these feminine nouns and adjectives being used. As Dr. Martin mentioned, she wasn't first called a judge. She was called a prophet, which indicates this is her primary role. Her primary role is to communicate the message of God to the people, to preach to the people. Second, the word or the phrase, the wife of Lapidoth. Now, we have several debates occurring around this phrase, the wife of Lapidoth. I tend to agree that this word could be translated as a fiery woman. There are several reasons for it. So rather than the wife of Lapidoth, it could mean a fiery woman. One, the word wife in Hebrew can also mean woman. Second, Lapidoth, again, is a feminine noun. And it's unlikely that a man, a Hebrew male, would be given a feminine name, right? But the word Lapidoth can also mean torch. So it could be a woman of torches or a fiery woman. And most scholars today seem to agree with that translation, that the better translation is not a wife of Lapidoth, but she is a fiery woman. I also think that phrase or that translation is best suited here in this verse because, one, she is considered a prophet. Now, she cannot prophesy or preach God's message without being filled with the Spirit, without having the Spirit. And so it's the Spirit's power and fire that makes her this woman of torches, or this fiery woman. So it's not that she had this this quick-tempered personality. That's not what it means, I don't believe. It's just that she's a woman who who's decisive, who is powerful. She's full of wisdom, and she's empowered and clothed with the Spirit of God. And then thirdly, we see that she is already judging Israel. So unlike the other judges, it says that God raised up Othniel and Ehud, and then we will see he raises up Samson from birth. So, but he does not raise up Deborah, because Deborah is already functioning in that role. She is already judging Israel, and people recognize her wisdom. Why would you come to somebody to judge them? Why? When Solomon prayed for wisdom, what was the very next thing we read?
They started coming
to him, and we read the story of him judging between the two mothers to see which one was the right and true mother, right? And so here we see that Deborah is a prophet, and she's a woman of wisdom who makes right decisions. And then so she used to sit under her own palm tree, and the people of Israel recognized her wisdom, and they came to her for judgment.
Absolutely. Let's go on and read a few more verses. Where did we get to? We got down to verse 4, 5.
So read 6.
Verse 6. She sent and summoned Barak the son of Abinoam from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, Has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you, Go, gather your men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun? And I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the river Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. Barak said to her, "If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go." And she said, "I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you're going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. And Barak called out Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh. And 10,000 men went up at his heels, and Deborah went up with him. So let's take a look there at what we have. You want to comment on those verses?
Well, again, these verses show. So verse 6 shows Deborah as a decisive woman, a woman who makes decisions, but she's also authoritative, right? Because the text says she sent and she summoned, she called Barak, right? So again, she's authoritative, she's decisive, and she functions, or she acts like a commander of an army, even though it doesn't say that she is, but that's what a commander would do, a leader would do. She sends and she summons Barak, and by the word of the Lord, she commissions him to lead the Israelite army to attack the king of Canaan, who is Jabin. But the question there, when she meets Barak, she says, "Has not the Lord commanded you?" Some scholars seem to think that Barak had already received this commandment from the Lord, but he is probably afraid to act. And so Deborah has to call him and remind him, and say to him, "Look, the Lord has already commanded you to go and attack and the enemy." And so she says to him, "Go gather your men at Mount Tabor." And she gives him direction, as to what to do. So she specifies the location where Barak is to encamp, the number of soldiers he is to recruit, the names of the tribes who will be involved, the name of the enemy, the enemy's general, and the exact location of the battle. And I don't remember the name of the scholar, but one scholar said that Barak's name means lightning, but he doesn't strike until Deborah commands. And I thought that's very good.
Yeah.
So she's speaking as the messenger of Yahweh. Again, she is a prophet, and she assures Barak of victory, declaring, "I will give him into your hand," which is the Lord will give him into his hand. There is no indication that Barak questions Deborah's credentials or that he is disturbed by her gender. Nevertheless, his response is less than enthusiastic. And again, his response indicates that he is not disturbed by her gender or considers her gender to be weak or Deborah to be a weak woman.
No.
Because he says to her, when you were reading this, it didn't occur to me, and I'm not trying to compare Deborah to God, but it reminded me of Moses saying to God, "Unless you go with me, I will not go."
Yeah.
And so Barak, responds in a similar manner to Deborah. So it seems as though Deborah's presence assures Barak of victory. And so he says to her, again, "Unless you are physically present with me, I am not going." And John Wesley writes, his refusal to go without her shows his weakness of faith, that he could not trust God's word alone as he ought to have done. So because Barak does not believe the word of the Lord that comes from Deborah, because Barak is afraid to go into battle as the Lord has commanded him, Deborah says that the victory will go to a woman.
Right. So it says Deborah arose and went with him. Well, there's the word arose that we've been talking about, rose up, and went. And Barak called out the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali, and they went up at his heels, and Deborah went up with him. So she said, God will give the enemy into the hand of a woman. At this point, we don't know who that is yet.
Right. So you might be thinking it's Deborah.
We might be thinking it's Deborah, but we find out it's somebody else. We find out that Heber, in verse 11, it says, Heber the Kenite of the children of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, had separated himself from the Kenites and pitched his tent near the terebinth tree at Zaanaim, which is beside Kadesh. So Heber, the Kenites had joined in with the tribe of Judah earlier. We read about it in Joshua and also in Judges chapter 1. But so he is a nomad, a shepherd, and so they're living in tents, and they're at Kadesh, and so they reported to Sisera. They went and told Sisera that Barak. It says they reported to Sisera that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor. So Sisera gathered together all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the people that were with him from Harosheth HaGoyim to the river Kishon. Then Deborah said to Barak, Up, for this is the day in which the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand. Has not the Lord gone out before you? So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him, and the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all of his army with the edge of the sword before Barak. And Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled away on foot. But Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Harosheth HaGoyim, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left. That's a great battle. So, just to comment, our time's about gone, so we're going to comment on these verses, and then we'll leave the rest of the story till next time. But Deborah escorts Barak to the place of battle, and as soon as they encamp there, they're betrayed by Heber, who is a descendant of Moses' father-in-law. So Sisera assembles his army and prepares to engage in battle, and Deborah says, Get up, Barak. It's time. Today's the day. The Lord has gone out before you. And so now she delivers a second prophetic word that specifies the exact timing for Barak's attack on the enemy. And Deborah's words sound much like those of Moses, who had said in Deuteronomy when they were in battle with the Amalekites. He said, The Lord goes before you. He will be with you. He will not fail you. Like Moses, she speaks with no indication of uncertainty, very confidently, providing Barak with assurance he needs to win the battle. Now, Deborah does not lead the army, but as you pointed out, she told the exact number of soldiers to take, the tribes to take, where to go to battle, when to go to battle. She's directed the battle. And I would argue that it's because she is a prophet.
Right. Yes.
You don't find anywhere in the Bible that a prophet led an army. The prophets didn't lead the army. The prophets told the generals what to do. The prophets told the kings what to do, gave directions. That's parallel to Moses in Exodus 17. Moses directed Joshua. Joshua fought the battle, but Moses gave directions. Moses didn't lead the army. Joshua was the commander of the army. So similarly, Moses gave the command just as Deborah did. Moses went with Joshua to the battle, just like Deborah did, but Moses did not participate in the battle. Deborah and Moses are acting as prophets, not as commanders, not as soldiers. So, and then later on in chapter 5, Deborah writes a song about it, which corresponds also to Moses, who wrote a song, a battle song, Exodus 17:14 says that Moses wrote a song to commemorate the winning of that battle. So you want to do you want to add anything else before we close, and we'll pick that up right there next time.
Yeah, I think these verses also illustrate and confirm the fact that Deborah is a prophet, because it says that when she arose, it says all of the men, all of the army fell that day. And so, again, harking back to um, when she said that the Lord has delivered the enemy into your hands. And so here there's a confirmation of that all of Sisera's army fell that day. Also, remember again that Sisera had 900 iron chariots, which indicated his strength of his army. But because the Lord was with the people of Israel, those 900 chariots had no effect or no power over the children of Israel. Those iron chariots were impotent, and so Sisera, therefore, was not powerful against the Israelites. I think it's also interesting that Sisera was a commander of 900 chariots, but at the very end, he had to flee on foot. He had to descend that powerful weapon, because the iron chariot was a weapon in that day and time. And so he had to descend from that powerful weapon and flee on foot, showing again the ineffectivity of that iron chariot against God's army.
Right. Very often in the Bible, God's people are outnumbered, and the physical weapons of the enemy are much greater. But to quote from David's friend Jonathan, the son of Saul, Jonathan said, God can win the battle either by many or by few. You know, one person with the Lord is a majority, as the old saying goes. So I always like to end on a positive note, and my positive note would be that we, as God's children, often feel like we don't have the resources, we don't have what's necessary, and we're going to say, "Oh, if the Lord just helped me win the lottery, I could have the money to, I could have the money to do this, I could have the money to do that." But the Bible said the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. God has chosen a method, and that is that his people give tithes and offerings. And if every Christian would give their tithes and offerings, the church would have more than enough money to do everything it needs. So that's the method God has chosen. But still, and if we lack, whatever we lack, God can make up through his power and his spirit. It's not our might, it's not our power. What does Zechariah 4:6 tell us? Is not by
might, not by power, but it's by the Spirit, says the Lord.
There you go. And that's my last word. That's your last. So anything else?
It's my last word too. Good last word.
Not by might, not by power, but by my spirit, saith the Lord. Thank you all for listening. And we'll start up with chapter 4, verse 17 next time. May God bless you.